Welcome to your deep dive.
Oh, I like that.
So today we are diving into the world of classic American desserts, all thanks to you, actually.
Right.
You shared this incredible resource, BraveTart by Stella Parks,
Mm.
and we are thrilled to uncover its surprisingly rich history and practical baking wisdom
Yeah.
just for you.
I love Stella Parks. I mean, BraveTart is just, it's so much more than just a cookbook.
Right?
You know?
Right.
It's like you said, it's history.
It's a journey, like through American baking, and packed with surprising facts, debunked myths, and really getting into the science behind perfect desserts.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll be touching on everything from the fascinating origins of the chocolate chip cookie to the evolution of ice cream, all with the aim of giving you a deeper appreciation and understanding of, like, how did we get here?
Yes. And also, like, why are these desserts so popular?
Yeah.
What is it about these that have made them endure
Right.
for so long?
Yeah.
Some of them for, over 100 years.
Yeah.
And so Stella Parks, she emphasizes the idea of baking from scratch.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's not presented as like a hardcore rule,
Right.
but more as like, hey, if you really want to connect with the process and have fun in the kitchen, like, why not give it a try?
Yes.
And I love her approach to measurement.
Yes.
Where it's like accuracy is everything in baking. So she's all about using a scale for weight, cups for volume.
Mm-hmm.
You will not find, the dreaded fluid ounce.
Yes.
Anywhere in her recipes.
Thank goodness, because that one is, I always have to Google that one.
Me too. Yeah.
And then the book really shines a light on the importance of quality ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
Not all national brands of chocolate and cocoa are created equal.
Oh, for sure.
And she even delves into, like, the nuances between different types of flour and sugar.
Right.
So we're going to get started with cookies and candy.
Okay.
They're more than just sweet snacks.
Yeah.
They are like a window into history.
So much history packed into these little treats.
Okay, so let's think about the turn of the 20th century. What was going on with American desserts at that time?
Well, there was, believe it or not, a big drop in chocolate prices.
Oh.
And so that kind of spurred this huge wave of innovation with sweet treats.
Okay.
So suddenly you had all these new things appearing in drugstores. Chocolate sodas, sundaes, shakes, even the first chocolate sprinkles.
Wow.
Emerged in Brooklyn during this era.
Interesting.
And this was also when Milton Hershey kind of burst onto the scene and introduced America to the concept of milk chocolate.
Milk chocolate.
Which was a huge shift. It wasn't just about, a new type of chocolate.
Right.
It actually made chocolate more accessible to a wider audience.
Yeah.
Who might have found the darker chocolates, too bitter.
So interesting. So it's like a whole socioeconomic shift in a way.
Right.
Because now it's available to more people.
Exactly.
Okay, and then like jump ahead a few decades to the World War II era.
All right.
And now we're in like rationing shortages.
Mm-hmm.
Things are very, very different.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how something as simple as a chocolate chip cookie actually became a powerful symbol of home.
Right.
And housewives were really encouraged to bake them for the troops.
Right.
Like there were actual ads and campaigns
Yes.
promoting this.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, chocolate was still, it was more affordable, but it was still precious.
Yeah.
But it really opened the door for, a little bit of experimentation at home, a little indulgence.
Right.
People were craving those chocolate treats.
Yes.
And this is really when you started seeing, those rich chocolate desserts that Americans still love today, like devil's food cake and brownies and fudge.
So interesting. So the chocolate chip cookie became this symbol of home.
Mm-hmm.
With all this chocolate enthusiasm going on, you'd think that, the chocolate chip cookie, that was an obvious next step.
You would think, right?
Yeah.
But actually, culinary historians suggest that the whole idea of combining chunks of chocolate with cookie dough was a really novel concept at the time. It wasn't obvious.
Yeah.
Like, think about it.
Yeah.
You got all these established candy bars.
Yeah.
You had Butterfinger, Snickers, Milky Way. All of those were around before the official invention of the chocolate chip cookie, which, we credit to Ruth Wakefield's Toll House recipe in 1938.
So crazy. So what were chocolate cookies like before the standalone chip, the chocolate chip?
Well, in the mid-19th century, chocolate was starting to become a little more available, more affordable, so it would be used, but sparingly.
Okay.
And it was often melted or shaved very finely,
Okay.
sort of diffuse a subtle chocolate flavor throughout the dough.
Right.
And then by the 1870s, we start to see actual recipes for chocolate jumbles. And they use a significant amount of grated chocolate.
Oh.
Stella Parks actually highlights one recipe from 1877, and it uses 2 cups of grated chocolate.
Wow.
That would have been a huge treat back
Yeah,
then.
that sounds very decadent for the era.
It does.
So Snickerdoodles, what's the origin story with those?
Okay, so the exact origin of the name is a little bit of a mystery, but what's really interesting is that Snickerdoodles likely evolved from, those 19th century cinnamon-scented coffee cakes called Snipdoodles.
Oh, Snipdoodles.
Snipdoodles. And they were basically thin sheet cakes, and they were intended to be eaten quickly
Okay.
before they staled. And then by the turn of the 20th century, they gradually transitioned into the drop cookies we know today.
Okay. But it wasn't like an overnight transformation.
No, it was very gradual.
Right.
And what's really fascinating is a really interesting twist here. In 1923 Crisco, they had a national ad campaign
Okay.
for Mrs. T's Snickerdoodles. But it was a very unusual cupcake.
Okay.
It was filled with nuts and spices and dried fruit, and then they had a mace-flavored frosting.
Wow.
But it wasn't super successful, but it did kind of introduce this idea of a butterless Snickerdoodle, which then really gained traction, during the butter shortages of World War II.
Interesting. That's a surprising detour in the Snickerdoodle story.
It is.
Okay, so what about brownies?
Okay, so this is a big one, right?
Yes. Everyone has their, favorite version.
Mm-hmm.
So where did they come from?
Okay, so the popular legend is that it originated with Bertha Palmer and the 1893 Chicago World's Fair.
Okay.
And that she, requested this dessert that ladies could easily manage while they were attending the fair. But there's actually not a ton of evidence to directly link them to the fair.
Really?
Yeah, it's more anecdotal. What we do know is that an 1899 Chicago cookbook featured a recipe for an unleavened chocolate cake.
Okay.
And that's widely considered like a proto-brownie.
Okay.
So it was in its initial stages.
Okay, so what was, the first published recipe that actually called it a brownie?
That would be 1904
Okay.
in the Lowell Sun newspaper.
Okay.
And this recipe, it had sugar, butter, eggs, chocolate, and flour. And it was in a couple other publications that year as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then in 1906, Fannie Farmer, she included a recipe in her Boston Cooking School cookbook. And that's really what helped popularize the brownie across the whole country.
Yeah, it's amazing how those recipes would travel. Okay, so marguerites and Malamars.
Okay. Yeah.
These feel a bit different from, your average cookie or cake.
They do.
So where do they fit in?
So these are fascinating because they're basically cracker-based treats.
Okay.
And the story starts with marguerites, which were essentially just bettered marshmallows on saltines.
Oh, okay.
So that starts popping up in magazines like Good Housekeeping around 1910.
Okay.
And then 1913, someone has this brilliant idea to add chocolate before the marshmallow.
Okay.
And this elevates it, right?
Right.
It's a simple snack, but it's like, oh,
Yes.
chocolate. And this, this sort of grassroots popularity seems to have inspired the big players.
Okay.
Because 10 months later, Nabisco launches its own version, Malamars.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how these simple creations in home kitchens
Right.
can go on to inspire mass-produced favorites.
That is a neat connection. Okay.
Mhm.
Let's move on to cakes.
Yes.
Layers of history and flavor.
Quite literally layers.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
Okay, so pineapple upside down cake.
Okay.
That's such a distinctive and almost retro dessert.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that topsy-turvy success story, how did that come about?
Okay, well, first of all, there's a common misconception about pineapples.
Okay.
People think that they continue to ripen after they're harvested,
Right.
but they don't.
Oh, really?
The sweetness and flavor is all developed while it's on the plant.
Okay.
The starch converts to sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's picked, that process stops.
Okay.
And this is kind of an important context
Right.
for understanding the rise of pineapple upside-down cake.
Okay.
So in 1924, Dole, they were looking for ways to promote the everyday use of their canned pineapple. And they released a cookbook called 99 Tempting Pineapple Treats.
Okay.
And they had, everything in there from savory dishes like baked ham with pineapple to, pineapple with cottage cheese.
Okay.
But the recipe that captured the public imagination was called pineapple cake glacé. And it was a relatively simple method. You combine crushed pineapple and brown sugar in a skillet, And then you just poured a basic cake batter right on top.
Okay.
And then as it bakes in the oven, the pineapple and sugar, they kind of bubble up and caramelized into this jammy layer.
Oh.
Once it's done, you flip it over and voila,
Upside down.
upside down.
And that was an immediate sensation.
Oh, yeah. By 1925, it had spread through national newspapers.
Wow.
There was a newspaper in Kentucky that called it a topsy-turvy cake.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, and then in Ohio, there were like hundreds of people that attended a local cooking demonstration of this cake.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so it really caught on.
It caught on. And then by 1928, those classic rings of canned pineapple
Right.
and maraschino cherries, that became the standard. And it's actually, the recipe itself has remained pretty consistent over the decades, which is kind of amazing.
It really speaks to the ingenuity of home bakers, like adapting to what was available.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Boston cream pie.
Okay.
That always struck me as a little bit misleading.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely a cake, not a pie.
A cake.
Recipes for it start popping up as early as like 1872
Okay.
in publications like the Methodist Almanac of all places.
Of all places.
And by the 1880s, it was pretty common in newspapers across the country. And it's funny because, the Parker House Hotel is famous for its dinner rolls.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not a lot of evidence to strongly link the Boston cream pie to the hotel.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I always thought that it was like their signature creation or something.
Yeah. It's a common assumption. Modern versions often call for cake flour, a neutral oil, like coconut oil, to get that really light and tender texture. And the marshmallow-based frosting, which is a key part of the dessert, actually has historical roots that go back to 1896.
Okay, so even those like modern touches have historical precedent.
They do.
So Devil's Food Cake and Red Velvet Cake,
Mm.
both so rich and intriguing in their history.
Yeah.
So where do they fit in?
Okay. So the first cake that we would recognize as like that intensely chocolate devil's food cake is often credited to Mrs. Rohrer's cookbook from 1902.
Okay.
But it's kind of a gradual process. As early as 1871, there were recipes for chocolate jelly cake, and they included instructions for mixing this boiled milk and chocolate jelly directly into the cake batter.
Okay.
And the term devil's cake, with explicit instructions for that mixing method, doesn't appear until 1893
Okay.
in Table Talk magazine.
Okay.
And that's where you see, okay, this technique of adding a hot chocolate mixture to the batter, that's what really intensified a chocolate flavor
Right.
and created that deep color.
So the devilish aspect was about the intense chocolate flavor that came from that.
Exactly.
Okay, so then Red Velvet Cake. What about that one?
Okay, so the story of red velvet starts a little earlier with the term velvet cake in 1873.
Hmm.
And this wasn't really referring to a flavor profile. It was about texture.
Okay.
So any cake with a really... Okay, so key lime pie. This is another good example of how our perception of culinary traditions can really evolve.
Mm.
So it's so strongly associated with Florida, but it's actually surprisingly absent from many vintage Florida cookbooks.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, Stella Parks, in her research, she went through tons of old Florida cookbooks, newspapers, magazines, and it's not there.
Hmm.
Lemon meringue pie, though, was super popular.
Okay.
And it was likely often made with limes,
Right.
especially after the big frost in 1895 that wiped out a lot of the lemon groves. But that key lime pie that we know and love today, with the graham cracker crust and the condensed milk custard,
Mhm.
that's distinct.
Yeah.
It's a distinct creation.
So if it's not in those old Florida cookbooks, like where did it actually come from?
Okay, so the clues kind of begin to surface in the early 20th century.
Okay.
You have Borden Dairy.
Mm-hmm.
They had their magic lemon cream pie recipe,
Okay.
which, in Florida, of course, they would have used limes.
Right.
And then in 1941, there was a food service magazine, and they had a recipe for key lime pie that used condensed milk and a graham cracker crumb crust.
Oh,
So you start seeing these hints.
right.
And then by 1952, it was so popular that it was declared Florida's most famous treat.
Oh, wow.
So it was a relatively recent development that then solidified its place as this beloved icon.
So interesting.
And then you have, the Persian lime,
Okay.
which is larger, more robust,
Right.
and they were really favored commercially.
Because they ship better.
Yeah, they shipped better, they stored better, they were easier to work with.
Okay.
But that led to a decline in the commercial availability of true key limes.
Oh.
So what we think of as key lime pie today is often actually made with Persian limes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, how traditions can be shaped
Yes.
over time.
Okay, let's move on to some fried delights.
All right.
Donuts. They're
Yeah,
just a classic.
they are.
So what does Stella Parks have to say about donuts? She really emphasizes that whether you prefer cake or yeast donuts, the key is freshness.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you gotta have them fresh.
Yeah.
And she says, leave the fancy glazes and all that to the donut shops.
Right.
And just appreciate the simple joy of a warm, homemade donut dusted with sugar.
That sounds perfect.
It's perfect.
What about animal crackers?
So animal crackers, they evoke such nostalgia for so many people.
Right.
But early animal crackers in the 1880s, they weren't super sweet.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was more about the novelty of the animal shapes.
Okay.
And they were marketed as a fun way to make eating enjoyable for children.
Right.
They didn't have the same sugar content or butter content that modern cookies do.
Right.
But those affordable and undeniably adorable animal shapes, that was the draw.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
It was about the playful aspect.
exactly.
Okay, Fig Newtons. Those feel like they've been around forever.
They do, don't they? So, there were recipes for fig-filled cookies.
But the Fig Newton, as a mass-produced product, that really benefited from the development of patented dough-sheeting machinery,
Oh, okay.
which happened in the late 19th century. And the National Biscuit Company, later known as Nabisco, they really promoted them after they were formed in 1898.
Mm-hmm.
Stella Parks' recipe, she uses dried figs for the filling, which not only makes it possible to bake them year-round, but it also creates a more intense fig flavor.
Okay, so that's a little upgrade.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Oreos?
Okay, so this is a fun one. The original chocolate sandwich cookie, it wasn't the Oreo.
Oh.
It was a cookie called Hydrox.
Okay, so I've heard of Hydrox.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the American Biscuit Company, which later became a part of Nabisco, they were in this fierce competition in the late 19th century, what was called the Biscuit War.
The biscuit war.
The Biscuit War, yeah.
Okay.
So, and Oreo was introduced by Nabisco, and it's obviously gone on to achieve, iconic status.
Yeah.
Stella Parks' version uses Dutch cocoa and baking soda for those dark, distinctive wafers.
Right.
And she actually suggests a touch of coconut extract for really authentic flavor that some believe was part of the original.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Little insider tip.
Yeah.
Okay, and lastly, Little Debbie oatmeal creme pies.
Oh, yes.
Such a unique and comforting, snack.
Stella Parks even points out that, they're marketed as a snack cake.
Yeah.
But they don't really neatly fit into cake or cream or pie.
All right.
It's its own thing.
They debuted in 1960, right?
They did, under the Little Debbie brand.
Okay.
But the story actually goes way back to 1934 when Other Doris and Ruth McKee purchased a bakery.
Okay.
So it's a real story of entrepreneurship
Yeah.
and innovation within, the American dessert landscape.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to see how all of these, these treats have evolved and become such integral parts of our culinary landscape. And, I love how BraveTart weaves together the history with practical baking advice.
Oh, yeah. Let's move on to something a little cooler.
Okay.
Ice cream and those wonderful fountain favorites.
Oh, delicious.
So let's go back in time.
Okay.
Early American ice cream. What was it like?
So, early American ice cream from the 19th century, it wasn't the light, fluffy, air-filled version that we know today. It was
Okay.
much denser,
Interesting.
more like gelato.
Okay.
And, Stella Parks, her recipes in BraveTart, they kind of lean towards this style.
Right.
So richer, creamier, more intense flavors.
Delicious.
Yeah.
What about, ice cream sodas and floats?
Okay.
Those feel like such quintessential American treats.
They are, and they have a really interesting possible connection to the temperance movement.
Really?
Yeah. So ice cream sodas, which is that combo of ice cream, syrup, and soda water, and then, floats, which are just ice cream and syrup. Those were sort of streamlined versions of these more elaborate fountain drinks.
Right. And the name Sundae might have actually originated from the Blue Laws.
Blue Laws.
Yeah, the Blue Laws of the 19th century that would force ice cream parlors to close on Sundays.
Oh.
So officially, you couldn't indulge
Right.
on Sundays. But pharmacists could still legally sell ice cream.
Really?
Yeah, for medicinal purposes.
Oh, okay.
So they would serve syrup-drenched ice cream without the soda.
Okay.
And sometimes they would top it with whipped cream
Okay.
to mimic, the foaminess of the soda.
Right.
And so that sundae could have been a way to get around the Sunday restrictions.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
So social, legal factors all played a role in the desserts that we enjoy.
Mm.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close,
Mm.
I mean, what are some of the key things that our listener can take away from this?
Well, I think you now have a much deeper understanding of how your favorite American desserts came to be.
Right.
It wasn't always straightforward.
We explored how economic shifts, global events, the power of advertising, even legal restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
all played a role in shaping these beloved treats.
Right.
And, I think what stands out to me is that, innovation often happened in the home kitchen.
Right.
Home bakers were really ingenious in adapting to what was available.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the desserts that we consider classic today really started out as, simple recipes made with readily available ingredients.
Right. Right. And here's a question to consider.
Okay.
Given how much history and marketing has influenced the desserts we consider classic today, like what new flavor combos or baking techniques might define the next generation of beloved treats?
That's a great question.
And who knows, maybe you listening, maybe your own kitchen experiments will be a part of that.
Could contribute to that.
Yeah.
It's really exciting to think about. And BraveTart has so much more to offer.
Right.
So we encourage you to delve into it further. Check out the recipes.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much more history in there. And who knows, you might just discover your new favorite dessert.
This deep dive is just the beginning
It is.
of your delicious exploration.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
It's been fun.
it has been fun.